Hi, I'm Kelsey from Crafting for Weeks, and today I'm going to go over some of my favorite ways to seam granny squares. To start off, I have two squares here. These are the sunflower granny squares. I have another video that shows you how to make these. I'm also using a blunt tip tapestry needle. You can also use a bent tip tapestry needle if you prefer. These are kind of nice for weaving in and out, so it's up to you. For this tutorial, I'm going to be using a contrasting yarn so you can see it better. But just keep in mind that if you want your seam to be invisible, you're going to want to use a matching yarn. Okay, so let's get started. So the first technique I'm going to do, you're actually going to need a crochet hook to do this. Now I'm just using a, this is a 4mm crochet hook just because that's what's on hand. Normally I would just use whatever I made my square with. Okay, so I'm going to start by finding the bottom stitch on this edge, which is one of these chain twos in the corner, and I'm going to insert my hook in there, and then I'm going to just slip stitch. So I'm just going to yarn over. The first ones can be a little fiddly, so you kind of just have to hold that tail down. And then you're just going to slip stitch in that stitch. And then you're going to find the same stitch on the opposite square, insert your hook, and you're going to slip stitch on this side as well. You might notice that I inserted my hook from the back to the front on that one, but moving forward, I'm going to be inserting my hook from the front to the back all the way through, and I'm going to be using the front loops only for a while, and then I will show you what it looks like to use both loops. So for now, the front loop, I'm going to insert from the front and then through the stitch to the back, and I'm going to slip stitch. And then on the opposite side, I'm going to go through the front of the stitch towards the back, and I'm going to slip stitch on this square. First slip stitch was a little crochet error that I caught in the editing process, but I definitely recommend picking a direction and sticking with it. So I'm going to alternate inserting my hook the same way through the front loops all the way through. And then once I get about halfway through here, I will switch it to going through both loops so that you can see the difference in what the stitch looks like. So for now, I'm just alternating on one square, going through the front loop of the stitch and a slip stitch, and then on the opposite square, going through the front loop of the stitch and a slip stitch. Okay, here we go. This is what the zigzag stitch looks like. It's a really tight join, so it's going to hold things together really securely. And like I mentioned, this half I only went through the front loops of the stitch on both squares. And remember, I was inserting the hook from the front of the stitch through the middle towards the back. Okay, so this is what the back of the join looks like. It's kind of got, again, a zigzagging motion, but it definitely looks different from the front, and you can see how secure that it's going to hold. So this is a great stitch to use for the Penelope blanket. If you're not wanting to use a continuous join, you can use this one instead. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and do it through both loops so you can see the difference. And I'm just going to fast forward through this part a little bit so that you can see the finished look, because you already know slip stitch on each side. Okay, so let's go ahead and do our compare and contrast on the two different techniques. This section right here was front loop, and this section right here was both loops. So when we flip it over, the top half is going to be our front loops. So this right here, and you can see how it's kind of tucked into the middle of the seam. And then this bottom section is going through both loops, and you can see how that zigzag is kind of on the top of the seam, if that makes sense. So that's the difference between the two techniques on the stitch. Both ways are going to have a pretty secure join. So now if I were finishing this, I would weave this end in right here, and then I would continue working all the way up, and when I got to this seam, I would just start in on my next square, and if I'm going over an existing seam, I'm going to chain one and then start my next square. So that chain one stitch would go over an existing seam of zigzag stitch, and then you would start in on your next row of granny squares. Okay, so next up is the invisible seam. This one is great for if you don't want your seam to be visible. So we're going to start by coming up through the center of your stitch, and I like to come up through the back of the stitch just because it's easier to weave your end when you're finished. So I'm going to do that, and there's a little gap. I apologize. Here we go. We'll get started. So through the center of a stitch, you see those V's. We're working through one stitch and through the center of the V on the next stitch. So then I'm just kind of pulling my yarn through. I like to have 2 to 3 times the length of the seam in my yarn. So here on this side, I'm going through the center of the V and then up through the next one. When you first start this stitch, you go back and forth through the first stitch more than once, which is why there was a little gap there. So I'm going to turn this on its side so you can see where my V's are, and I'm going up through the stitch that I worked in last time, and then putting my needle up through the next stitch that has not been worked in yet. And then I'm pulling it through, and I'm going to repeat that on the opposite side. Start in the stitch you worked in previously, and then pull your needle up through the center of the V on the opposite side. So you can see that I'm struggling with the stitches on this side a little bit more than the other side, and that's really just because the square is upside down. It's not intentional, but I think it's great to see that you can still work this stitch no matter which direction your stitches are facing. It's just a little bit more fiddly, like my V's are facing down, so it's a little bit more fiddly to get your needle through. And I really think that the bent tip needle makes this stitch a little bit easier. Obviously you can do this with your straight tapestry needle, but the bent tip does make it easier to go through the center of those stitches. Okay, I'm going to zoom ahead a little bit so you can see how to close this. You're really just going to be taking the ends and you're just going to be pulling it tight. I really only like to do this with a couple stitches at a time so it doesn't warp the fabric, because the more stitches you have, the harder it is to pull tight. But if you're only doing this with a couple stitches at a time, you won't have any warping in your fabric. So here you can see how the seam right here lays really flat next to the other square. So you can barely see that yarn. And if you were using a coordinating color, you wouldn't even see this white through the center. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to show you how to just do this one stitch at a time. You're going up through, oops, don't want to tie that in a knot. Okay, you're going up through the V's, and then you're just going to pull this stitch taut and then go through your next one. So this is a way to make sure that you're not getting any like warping in your fabric. When you're like pulling multiple stitches closed, you can just pull them close one stitch at a time. Now if you're going all the way to the top, once you get to that top corner, you'll either stop and weave in your end, or you will move on to your next set of squares if you're going to continue. Okay, so next up is the flat slip stitch seam. We're going to be using a crochet hook for this one. I like doing them with a crochet hook because you don't have to have extra yarn pulled out. You can just pull it straight from your skein. Okay, so for this one, we're going to be inserting our hook from the front to the back through the back loop only. So we're going this direction. And then we're going to be inserting our hook on the opposite square the same way. So from the front to the back through the back loop only. And we're going to take our yarn it over, and we're going to do a slip stitch. And we're going to go through all of the loops on our hook right there. So both squares plus the slip stitch we started with. Okay, and that's pretty much it. We're going to repeat that in each stitch. So we're going to go through this next stitch, front to back, through the back loop only, and on the coordinating stitch on your second square, and slip stitch through all of those loops. And we're going to go again, front to back, and slip stitch through all 3 loops. Oops, dropped one. Slip stitch through all 3 loops on your hook. Okay, so I've done a few more stitches. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. You'll see that it has this cute little braid that goes right down the center of the seam. It's a pretty tight join. And you'll notice that because we worked in the back loops, this braid sits right in the center of the seam there. So let's go ahead and look at it from the back. And here you can see from the back that it gives you this nice tidy seam. It kind of looks like you did just like a back stitch by hand. Okay, so real quick, if you didn't want the seam to be quite so visible, you would want to use a coordinating color from your second square so that it would kind of hide in the colors of this square right here. So you would go, the green was my second attached square, so you would go with the green color or whichever is your second square color. Okay, and last but not least is the mattress stitch. I did a lot of research on the mattress stitch, and from what I found is there is no definitive way to do the mattress stitch. I went through 5 different tutorials and learned 5 different ways. So I'm just going to show you the way that I like to do this. So I'm going to start from the back and come through the center of the stitch towards the front. And this is again working in that first stitch of the side. I'm going to find that same first stitch. I'm going to come in through the back and then work out through the center. And I'm going to kind of continue that. So over here, I'm going to find my next little V shape here, and I'm going to come just through the back loop of that from the back to the front. And I'll pull that through. And then I'm going to find the coordinating stitch on the opposite side. Come in from the back to the front with the back loop only. I'm going to show you the difference between the back loop and the front loop in a sec, but then you're just going to kind of pull these tight so that that stitch kind of disappears. Again, if you're using a coordinating yarn, it would really disappear. And then I'm going to continue from the back to the front and then repeating on the opposite side. I find that this one is a little bit easier if you turn the squares on their side a little bit. Okay, I'm going to speed through a couple of these so you can see how it looks when it's all seamed together, and then I'm going to go going through both loops so you can see the difference. Okay, so once you get to this point, you're just going to hold both ends and pull that yarn tight, and that's going to close up your seam. If you have a little warping, you can just stretch it back out and it should be fine. So the premise of this stitch is really that you're just kind of interlocking both sides and making it invisible in the process. So there's no certain specific way to do that. Like I said, I've seen a lot of different ways to do this stitch. As long as your sides kind of go like this, you're probably doing a version of the mattress stitch. So figured I would just share how I like to do it, and I will go ahead and show you how it looks going through both loops instead of just the back loop. So I'm still going from the back to the front on this particular round, and I'm going through both loops instead of just that back loop. So I'm coming under the entire stitch instead of through the center of it. So I'm going to do a couple of these, and then I will show you the comparison of how the finish seam looks once it's closed. Okay, so I finished a few more stitches, and I'm going to go ahead and pull this closed so you can see the difference between going through both loops and going through the back loops only. So the top section of this is both loops and the bottom section is back loops. The seam itself looks pretty similar. The top section is a little bit tighter than the bottom section, but ultimately I don't think it makes a huge difference. You're really just trying to interlock your sides, and I feel like both of those techniques accomplish that. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful in seaming your granny squares. If you would like a project to work on that uses granny squares, be sure to check out the Penelope Blanket on my blog at craftingforweeks.com.